Returning to my parents' forgotten house after they passed, a single call made my blood run cold. The truth they uncovered shattered everything I knew when the family lawyer asked why I never claimed the other property. I laughed and said there was no other property, just this old house in Montana that had been empty for 12 years. I am Marin, 34 years old, and until that phone call from Reed Carlson, my parents' estate attorney, I believed I knew everything about my family. The dusty two-bedroom ranch house in rural Montana was all that remained of Georgia and Vincent's modest lives, or so I thought. They had died within 6 months of each other last year, first my father from a sudden heart attack, then my mother from what the doctors diplomatically called failure to thrive, but what I knew was a broken heart. I had been their only child, raised in that small house with its peeling paint and creaking floors, where dinner conversations revolved around stretching paychecks and whether we could afford new winter coats. Reed's call came on a Tuesday morning while I was sorting through boxes of my parents' belongings in their living room. The house smelled of mothballs and decades-old potpourri, every surface coated in a fine layer of dust that spoke to 12 years of abandonment. My parents had moved to a tiny apartment in Billings when I turned 22, claiming the house was too much to maintain, too full of memories. I had visited them in that cramped apartment regularly, never questioning why they had held on to this property, never asking why they paid taxes on a house they refused to sell or rent. Miss Marin, Reed's voice carried the careful professional tone of someone about to deliver complicated news. I've been going through your parents' estate documents, and there's a significant asset that wasn't included in the initial inventory. I need to know why you haven't submitted a claim for the Seattle property. My hand froze on the box I was sorting. Seattle property? Reed, my parents never owned anything in Seattle. They barely left Montana their entire lives. According to the deed I'm holding, they purchased a commercial building in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood 32 years ago. The property is currently valued at approximately $4.7 million. The box slipped from my hands, old photographs scattering across the worn linoleum floor. $4.7 million. My parents, who had clipped coupons religiously and drove their cars until the wheels fell off, who had told me we couldn't afford college, so I worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college, owned property worth nearly $5 million. That's impossible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My parents were school teachers. They lived paycheck to paycheck. Where would they have gotten the money to buy property in Seattle? Reed cleared his throat, the sound heavy with implication. That's what I was hoping you could tell me. The purchase was made in 1993, paid in full with cash, no mortgage, no loan documents, just a cashier's check for $600,000. My legs felt weak. I sank onto the threadbare couch, disturbing a cloud of dust that made me cough. 1993. I would have been 2 years old. My parents had bought a building worth more than $500,000 when I was barely out of diapers, then spent the next 3 decades telling me we couldn't afford anything beyond necessities. There has to be some mistake, I said, even as my mind raced through memories. The careful budgeting, the secondhand clothes, the times I had begged for school trips or activities and been told the money simply wasn't there. Who's been managing this property? Who's been collecting rent? That's the interesting part, Reed replied. The property has been managed by a firm called Cascade Properties LLC for the past 30 years. Rent payments have been deposited directly into a bank account in your mother's maiden name, an account that was never disclosed during probate. I only found it because I was doing a comprehensive asset search after noticing some irregularities in their tax returns. My mouth went dry. A secret account, a secret property. My parents had maintained this elaborate deception for my entire life. But why? How much money is in this account? I asked. Papers rustled on Reed's end of the line. Current balance is just over $2 million. But that's after regular withdrawals over the years. Based on the transaction history, I'd estimate the account has seen approximately $8 million flow through it over 3 decades. $8 million. The number was so absurd I almost laughed. My parents, who had made me feel guilty for wanting a new bike, who had eaten the cheapest cuts of meat and grown their own vegetables to save money, had been sitting on millions. Who was receiving the withdrawals? I demanded, anger beginning to burn through the shock. Reed hesitated. Your mother's sister, Diane. She's been receiving a monthly payment of $5,000 for the past 28 years. The payment stopped when your mother died. Aunt Diane, my mother's older sister, who lived in an expensive condo in downtown Seattle, who drove luxury cars and took international vacations, who had always treated my family with a mixture of pity and condescension, making comments about our simple life and humble circumstances. She had known. She had been receiving money from a secret account while watching her sister raise a daughter in poverty. "I need everything," I said, my voice hard. "Every document, every transaction record, every piece of paper related to this property and that account. And Reed, I want to know if there's anything else. Anything at all that my parents kept hidden." "There is one more thing," Reed said carefully. "The property in Seattle? It's been rented to the same tenant for 30 years, a man named Thomas Blackwood. He's been paying significantly below market rate, about a quarter of what similar properties command. Your parents renewed his lease annually at the same low rate, despite the property value increasing dramatically." Thomas Blackwood. The name meant nothing to me, but something in Reed's tone suggested it should. "Who is he?" "I was hoping you could tell me that. But I can tell you that he's listed as the co-founder of a tech company that went public 15 years ago. He's worth approximately $200 million, yet he's been paying your parents $2,500 a month for a property that should be commanding $10,000 minimum. My parents had given this man a sweetheart deal for 3 decades, while I wore thrift store clothes and worked through college. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. But more than betrayal, I felt a burning need to understand. What could have possibly motivated them to maintain this facade? To let me struggle while they sat on millions? I stood, surveying the shabby house with new eyes. Every faded curtain, every worn carpet, every appliance held together with duct tape and prayer, all of it a lie. This wasn't poverty. This was theater. My entire childhood had been a performance, and I had been the only one who didn't know it. "Send me everything," I told Reed. "I'm driving to Seattle tomorrow. I want to see this property for myself, and I want answers." After hanging up, I walked through the house where I had spent my formative years, seeing it differently now. The walls that I had always thought needed fresh paint were actually hiding something else. The floors that creaked were concealing secrets. In my parents' bedroom, I opened the closet and began pulling out boxes, looking for anything that might explain this massive deception. That's when I found it. A small fireproof safe hidden beneath a pile of old blankets on the top shelf. The lock was simple, and I broke it open with a screwdriver from my father's toolbox. Inside were documents. Lots of documents. Property deeds, bank statements, and a thick leather journal in my mother's handwriting. The first entry was dated March 15, 1993. "We made the deal today," my mother had written in her precise script. "The money came through and we bought the building. Thomas promises this will secure Diane's future, and ours, but we can never tell Maureen. She can never know what we did." My hands shook as I continued reading. Page after page detailed a conspiracy that had shaped my entire existence. My parents hadn't just bought property, they had made a deal that would haunt them for 3 decades. And Aunt Diane hadn't just been receiving money. She had been the architect of the entire scheme. As I read deeper into my mother's confessions, one phrase appeared repeatedly, written with such force that the pen had torn through the paper. "For Diane's sake, we must never let Marin know the truth." I set the journal down, my mind reeling. Whatever this secret was, it was big enough that my parents had sacrificed my well-being to protect it. Big enough that they had lived in self-imposed poverty while their wealth accumulated in hidden accounts. Big enough that they had taken it to their graves. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I would accept their carefully constructed reality without question. They had assumed I wouldn't dig deeper. They had assumed wrong. I picked up my phone and called Reed back. "I'm not driving to Seattle tomorrow," I said. "I'm flying out tonight. And Reed, I need you to compile everything you can find on Thomas Blackwood and my Aunt Diane. I want to know every connection, every business dealing, every interaction they've had over the past 30 years. "What are you thinking?" Reed asked. I looked at the journal, at my mother's desperate words, at the evidence of a lifetime of deception spread across the bed. "I'm thinking my parents weren't the only liars in this story. And I'm thinking it's time someone finally told the truth. The flight to Seattle gave me 6 hours to read every page of my mother's journal. What I discovered made me sick with rage, grief, and a growing determination to unravel 3 decades of lies. The entries painted a picture so ugly, so fundamentally wrong, that I had to read several passages multiple times to believe they were real. My mother's first entries from 1993 were almost cheerful. She and Vincent had come into money, a significant amount of money from an unspecified source. Aunt Diane, 10 years older than my mother and apparently facing some unnamed crisis, had convinced them to invest in Seattle real estate. Thomas Blackwood was Diane's boyfriend at the time, a young entrepreneur with big dreams and no capital. The deal they struck was simple on the surface. My parents would buy a building, Thomas would rent it cheaply while he built his business, and when he succeeded, everyone would profit. But the entries from later that year took a darker turn. Diane says we can never discuss the origin of the money, my mother wrote in August 1993. She says if anyone asks, we should claim it was an inheritance from Vincent's uncle. Thomas knows the truth, but he's promised silence. The guilt is eating at me, but Diane insists this is the only way to protect all of us. I flipped ahead, looking for more details about this mysterious money. What I found instead were years of entries describing my parents' growing paranoia and regret. They had convinced themselves that living modestly was the only way to avoid suspicion. They rationalized their decision to deprive me by claiming they were teaching me real values and protecting me from dangerous questions. By 1998, 5 years into their deception, my mother was writing about Diane's changing personality. My sister has become someone I don't recognize, one entry read. The monthly payments were supposed to be temporary, just until she got back on her feet, but now she expects them indefinitely. She says it's the least we owe her after everything she's done for us. When I suggested reducing the amount, she threatened to tell Maren everything. Diane had been blackmailing her own sister. For 28 years, she had extracted money using the threat of revelation, and my parents had been too afraid or too guilty to stop her. The plane landed in Seattle just after midnight. I took a taxi directly to the Capitol Hill address Reed had given me. The building stood on a corner lot, 3 stories of beautifully maintained brick and stone. The ground floor housed a trendy coffee shop. The second floor appeared to be office space, and the third floor had been converted into a luxury apartment. Even in the dim streetlight, I could see this was prime real estate. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the building my parents had owned for my entire life. This single property could have paid for my education, for better health care when my father's heart started failing, for comfort in my mother's final lonely months. Instead, it had sat here generating wealth that flowed to Diane while I struggled. My phone buzzed with a text from Reed. Found something big. Call me when you're alone. I walked until I found an all-night diner and ordered coffee I didn't plan to drink. Reed answered on the first ring. Thomas Blackwood's company went public in 2009, Reed said without preamble. At the time, he owned 60% of the shares. Current value of his stake is around $200 million. But here's what's interesting. In 2008, right before the IPO, he transferred 15% of his company's shares to a trust. Let me guess, I said bitterly. Diane is the beneficiary. Not exactly. The trust was established in your mother's name, with Diane as the trustee. According to the documents, the shares were payment for services rendered and ongoing support. Maren, those shares are currently worth approximately $50 million. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, splashing across the table. $50 million. My mother had owned $50 million in stock while telling me we couldn't afford a decent car. There's more, Reed continued. I pulled Thomas Blackwood's court records. In 1992, he was arrested on suspicion of securities fraud. The charges were dropped, but the victim in that case was a woman named Patricia. I did some digging on her. And she disappeared in late 1992. Her family filed a missing persons report, but the investigation went nowhere. She was never found. My blood ran cold. Reed, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, I'm just telling you what I found. Patricia was last seen with Thomas Blackwood. 3 months later, your parents suddenly had $600,000 in cash. Money they refused to explain. Money that appeared right after someone vanished. The implication hung in the air between us, too terrible to voice directly. My parents, my ordinary school teacher parents, had been involved in something far worse than financial deception. "Send me everything you have on Patricia," I said, my voice steady despite the horror coursing through me. "And Reed, I need you to find out if Diane knew about this. I need to know exactly what my parents did and who else was involved." After hanging up, I sat in that diner until dawn, my mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. My parents had raised me to be honest, to follow rules, to do the right thing. But their entire lives had been built on a foundation of something dark enough that they had sacrificed their only child's well-being to hide it. At 7 a.m., I walked back to the building and waited outside the coffee shop. At 8, a man in an expensive suit emerged from the third-floor apartment and headed toward a Tesla parked at the curb. He was in his 50s, fit and confident, with the easy smile of someone who had never worried about money. "Thomas Blackwood?" I called out. He turned, his smile faltering slightly. "Yes? Can I help you?" "I'm Marin, Georgia and Vincent's daughter. I believe we need to talk about the building you've been renting from my family for 30 years. The color drained from his face. He glanced around the empty street as if calculating whether to run. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of the property deed. "Because according to this, my parents owned this building. And according to other documents I've found, you've been paying far below market rent for 3 decades. I'm curious why my parents would give you such a generous deal." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Your parents and I had an arrangement. It was mutually beneficial." "Mutually beneficial," I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting way to describe a situation where you paid almost nothing for prime Seattle real estate while their daughter wore secondhand clothes and worked 3 jobs to afford community college." "I didn't know about that," Thomas said, but his eyes shifted away from mine. "Didn't you?" I stepped closer. "Or did you just not care? Tell me, Thomas, what exactly was this arrangement based on? What did my parents have that made you willing to give them shares worth $50 million? His face went from pale to ashen. "Who told you about the shares?" "I have a very thorough attorney. Now, I'm going to give you 2 choices. You can tell me the truth about what happened in 1992, about Patricia, about the money my parents suddenly had, and about why Diane has been blackmailing them for 3 decades. Or I can take what I already know to the police and let them start connecting dots." Thomas looked around again, then jerked his head toward the building entrance. "Not here. Come upstairs." The third-floor apartment was everything I had expected. Gleaming hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows with views of downtown Seattle, furniture that probably cost more than my parents had spent on household items in their entire lives. Thomas poured himself a drink at 9 in the morning and downed it in one gulp. "Your Aunt Diane was my girlfriend in 1992, he began. "I was working in securities, trading on insider information, making good money but taking huge risks. Patricia was one of my clients. She figured out what I was doing and threatened to report me." "So you killed her," I said flatly. "No," Thomas spun toward me, genuine horror in his eyes. "God, no, I would never—" He stopped, took a breath. I panicked. I told Diane what was happening. She said she could make it go away, that her sister and brother-in-law could help. Georgia and Vincent were desperate for money. They had medical bills from a miscarriage you probably never knew about, and Georgia couldn't have more children after that. Diane convinced them to help me. "Help you how?" Thomas finished his second drink. "Your parents provided Patricia with what they thought was a legitimate investment opportunity. They convinced her to withdraw her savings, about $600,000, to invest in what they said was a sure thing. She trusted them because they were teachers, respectable people. They brought her the cash, and that same night, Patricia left Seattle. She told her family she was moving to start fresh somewhere else. She wired them occasional messages for a few months, then the communication stopped. But she never actually left Seattle, did she?" I said, pieces falling into horrible place. "I don't know," Thomas insisted. "I swear I don't know what happened to her. Diane handled everything. She took the money, gave your parents the cash to buy this building, and told me Patricia was gone for good. That was supposed to be the end of it. Except Diane started blackmailing my parents with their involvement in whatever happened to Patricia." Thomas nodded miserably. "She had them trapped. They'd helped make someone disappear and taken her money. Whether Patricia was dead or alive, your parents had committed serious crimes. Diane used that to keep them paying her, and she used it to keep me paying them through this sweetheart lease. We were all trapped in this web she'd created. And the shares? The $50 million? When my company was about to go public, Diane demanded I give your mother substantial equity. She framed it as insurance. If I ever stopped cooperating, she'd make sure the Patricia case was reopened with new evidence pointing to me. The shares were my guarantee that I'd keep quiet and keep paying rent. I looked around the luxury apartment, thinking of my parents' threadbare house. You've been living here like a king while my parents lived like paupers. They chose that, Thomas said defensively. Nobody forced them to live that way. Diane told them it was necessary to avoid suspicion, but that was just her manipulating them. They could have lived however they wanted. They just didn't have the spine to stand up to her. The contempt in his voice ignited something cold and hard in my chest. These people, Diane, Thomas, even my own parents, had treated my life as collateral damage in their schemes. They had robbed Patricia, destroyed my childhood, and lived with their secrets for 30 years while I struggled. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm despite the fury burning through me. You're going to transfer this building to my name. You're going to pay fair market rent going forward, backdated 5 years, and you're going to tell me everything you know about Patricia's disappearance. Or what? Thomas tried to sound defiant, but failed. Or I take this entire story to the police, along with the evidence of your involvement in insider trading, fraud, and making someone disappear. I'm sure the statute of limitations hasn't run out on all of your crimes. Even if it has, imagine what the publicity would do to your company's stock price. Your $200 million fortune would evaporate overnight. Thomas stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. What do you want to know? Thomas talked for 3 hours, and with each revelation, my understanding of my family's twisted history deepened. He claimed not to know Patricia's ultimate fate, but he provided details that painted a disturbing picture. Diane had been the mastermind from the beginning, manipulating everyone like pieces on a chessboard. According to Thomas, Diane had struggled with gambling debts in the early 90s. She had borrowed money from dangerous people and needed a way out. When Thomas's legal troubles with Patricia emerged, Diane saw an opportunity. She convinced my parents that helping Thomas would earn them a fortune and save her life. She had threatened suicide, claimed the loan sharks would kill her, deployed every manipulation tactic she could think of. Your mother loved Diane desperately, Thomas said. She would have done anything to save her. Diane knew that and exploited it ruthlessly. After Thomas finished, I left the building and went directly to Diane's condo in downtown Seattle. She lived in a gleaming high-rise with a doorman and private elevator access, the kind of place that screamed money and privilege. I convinced the doorman I was her niece visiting to discuss family matters, and he let me up. Diane answered her door in a silk robe, martini in hand despite it being barely noon. She was 64 but looked 50, maintained by expensive procedures and designer everything. Her eyes widened when she saw me, then narrowed with calculation. Marin, what a surprise. I would have thought you'd be in Montana, dealing with your mother's dusty old house. Can I come in? I asked pleasantly. I think we need to talk about Seattle real estate. Her face went carefully blank. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. The building Mom and Dad bought in 1993, the one worth nearly $5 million. The monthly payments you've been receiving for 28 years. Should I go on? Diane stepped back, letting me into her condo. The space was decorated like something from a design magazine. All white surfaces and abstract art and furniture that looked uncomfortable but expensive. She walked to her bar and poured herself another drink without offering me one. So you found out about the property, she said. Good for you. I suppose you want your inheritance now. I want the truth, I replied, starting with what really happened to Patricia. Diane's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. I don't know anyone by that name. Thomas Blackwood told me everything. The insider trading, the $600,000, my parents' involvement. The only piece missing is what actually happened to Patricia after she gave them her money. Thomas is a liar, Diane said flatly. Whatever he told you is fiction designed to protect himself. I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Thomas's voice filled the room. Diane handled everything. She took the money, Gave your parents the cash to buy the building and told me Patricia was gone for good. You recorded him? Diane's voice was sharp. That's illegal in Washington without consent. Actually, I'm pretty sure murder and fraud are also illegal, I said. So I guess we're all criminals here. Except I'm the one who can prove what you did. Diane set down her glass with deliberate care. What do you want? I already told you. The truth. She studied me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, weighing her options. Finally, she laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. You want the truth? Fine. Patricia is alive. She's been alive this whole time, living under a new identity in Toronto. I helped her disappear because she was terrified of Thomas and his associates. But I didn't let her leave with her money. I convinced your idiot parents to take it, and we used it to buy that building. Patricia got a new life, I got monthly payments, and your parents got to feel morally superior while secretly sitting on millions. Everyone won. Except me, I said quietly. I lost my entire childhood. I worked myself to exhaustion while you and Thomas lived in luxury, all because my parents were too afraid of you to spend a dime of their own money. Your parents' guilt was their problem, not mine, Diane said. I gave them an opportunity to be wealthy. If they chose to perform poverty instead of enjoying it, that's on them. The casual cruelty of her words was breathtaking. This woman had systematically destroyed her own sister's peace of mind, had blackmailed her for 3 decades, had stolen my childhood, and she felt no remorse whatsoever. Here's what's going to happen, I said, pulling out a folder Reed had prepared. You're going to sign these documents transferring all claims on the building and the stock shares to me. You're going to provide me with information on how to contact Patricia. And you're going to confess everything to the police, the fraud, the extortion, all of it. Diane laughed again. Or what? You'll expose your parents as criminals? Destroy their memory? I don't think so. You don't have the spine for it. I met her eyes steadily. You're right. I don't want to destroy my parents' memory, but I will if that's what it takes to make sure you face consequences. And unlike you, I'm not afraid of the truth coming out. I didn't do anything wrong. You have no proof of anything, Diane insisted. Thomas's recording is inadmissible. Your mother's journal is just the ravings of a guilty conscience. And Patricia has been gone for 30 years. Even if you found her, why would she help you? I smiled then, and something in my expression made Diane take a step back. You're right that Thomas's recording might not hold up in court, but I don't need it to. You see, while you've been sipping martinis in your luxury condo, I've been doing something you never taught my parents to do. I've been keeping detailed records. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. This is a video I made this morning, documenting everything in my parents' house. The journal, the financial statements, the evidence of 30 years of monthly payments from the secret account to you. And this, I swiped to another screen, is an email I've drafted to the IRS, detailing approximately $8 million in unreported income you've received over 3 decades. Diane's face went pale. You wouldn't. Watch me. I've also compiled a comprehensive file on Thomas Blackwood's insider trading activities in the early 90s. I'm sure the SEC would be very interested, statute of limitations or not. And I've hired a private investigator who's already tracked down Patricia in Toronto. She's willing to talk, by the way. Turns out she spent 30 years thinking my parents were innocent victims of your manipulation, not co-conspirators. You're bluffing, Diane said, but her voice wavered. Am I? I stood and walked to her wall of windows, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Here's the thing about being raised in poverty while secretly wealthy, Diane. It teaches you to be resourceful, patient, strategic. You thought my parents were weak because they didn't stand up to you, but I'm not my parents. I turned back to face her. You have 24 hours to sign those documents. If you don't, everything I have goes to the authorities. The IRS, the SEC, the Seattle Police Department's cold case unit. I'll make sure your name is plastered across every news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. And even if you don't go to jail, which you might, your reputation will be destroyed. Your comfortable life will be over. I could just kill you, Diane said softly. Make you disappear like I made Patricia disappear. Except you didn't make Patricia disappear, I reminded her. You helped her escape, and I've already uploaded copies of everything to my attorney and to a trusted friend with instructions to release it all if anything happens to me. You're not a killer, Diane. You're just a con artist who got away with it for too long. The next day, I received a call from Patricia. Reed's investigator had done his job well, and Patricia agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. She walked in looking nervous, a petite woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen too much pain. "I can't believe you found me," she said after we had ordered. "I've spent 30 years trying to disappear." "Diane told me you're alive." She made it sound like she saved you from Thomas. Patricia's laugh was harsh. "Diane saved me from Thomas by stealing my life savings, some rescue." Over the next 2 hours, Patricia told me her story. She had been a successful day trader in the early 90s when she discovered Thomas Blackwood's illegal activities. She had threatened to report him, and Thomas had threatened her back. Diane had approached her offering help, a way to escape Thomas's threats and start over somewhere safe. "Your parents were so sincere," Patricia said. "They convinced me they were investing my money in a legitimate opportunity. They said I'd get returns mailed to me in Toronto through a private company. I believed them because they were teachers. Who suspects teachers of fraud?" "Did you ever get any returns on your investment?" "Not a penny. After 6 months of excuses, I realized I'd been conned. But by then, I had a new identity, a new life in Toronto. Going back to Seattle and pressing charges would mean admitting I'd helped Thomas with insider trading. I would have gone to prison too. So I stayed quiet and tried to rebuild. "I'm sorry," I said, "for what my parents did to you." Patricia shook her head. "Your parents were victims too, in their way. Diane manipulated them. She's a master at finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. The question is, what are you going to do about her now?" I told Patricia my plan. As I laid it out, her eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with vindication. "Are you sure you can pull this off?" she asked. "I'm sure I'm going to try, but I need your help. I need you to be willing to testify about what happened." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. Then she nodded. "I've spent 30 years running. Maybe it's time to stop." That evening, Diane called me. "I'll sign your documents," she said tersely. "But this doesn't end here. I have lawyers. You'll never see a dime of that money." "Actually," I said pleasantly, "I don't need you to sign the documents anymore. I found a better solution." "What are you talking about?" "Patricia is back in Seattle. She's filing a civil suit against you for fraud, conspiracy, and emotional distress. Thomas Blackwood has agreed to testify about your role in the scheme, and I've provided the IRS with documentation of your unreported income. The criminal charges alone will probably put you away for years, but the civil suit will bankrupt you first." Silence on the line. Then, "You vindictive little bitch." "I learned from the best," I replied. "Oh, and Diane? The building and the stock shares already belong to me. My mother's will left everything to me, including assets she hadn't disclosed to you. Reed filed the paperwork this morning. You never had legal standing to any of it because the trust was in my mother's name, not yours. You were just the trustee, and a trustee's authority ends when the grantor dies." "I'll fight this," Diane hissed. "Please do. Every legal filing will create more documentation of your crimes. The longer you fight, the worse it gets for you. But here's the thing, Diane. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because you destroyed my childhood and tortured my parents for 30 years. You made my mother live in fear and guilt until the day she died. You turned my aunt, someone who should have loved and protected me, into a monster who stole from her own family." "Your mother was weak," Diane spat. "She could have stopped me at any time." "No," I said quietly. "She couldn't. Because you were her sister, and she loved you. She couldn't conceive of cutting you out of her life completely. But I can. I don't love you, Diane. I don't even know you. You're just someone who hurt people I cared about, and now you're going to pay for it." I hung up and blocked her number. The legal proceedings moved faster than I had expected. Patricia's lawsuit hit the news within days, and once reporters started digging, the story took on a life of its own. "Seattle tech mogul's dark secret," read one headline. "Teacher's daughter exposes 3-decade fraud," proclaimed another. Thomas Blackwood's company stock took a hit, though not as badly as I had threatened. He ended up settling with Patricia for an undisclosed sum, rumored to be around $20 million, and resigned from his company's board. His reputation was shattered, but he avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully with authorities. Diane was not so lucky. The IRS audit revealed decades of tax evasion totaling millions in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest. The state filed criminal fraud charges. Patricia's civil suit resulted in a judgment of $12 million, more than Diane had extracted from my parents over the years. To pay it, Diane had to sell her condo, her car, everything. She ended up in a small apartment in a rundown part of the city, working part-time at a grocery store because no one would hire her for anything else. I visited her once, 3 months after her world collapsed. She looked 10 years older, the expensive maintenance unable to mask the stress and bitterness etched into her features. "Are you happy now?" she asked when she opened the door. "No," I said honestly. "I'm not happy. My parents are still dead. My childhood is still stolen. Patricia still lost 30 years living in fear. Nothing I've done brings any of that back." "Then why did you do it?" I met her eyes. "Because actions have consequences. You spent 3 decades escaping consequences through manipulation and fear. I made sure that ended." "I'm your aunt," Diane said, something almost pleading in her voice. "Your family." "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't destroy each other." "You were never my family, Diane. You were just a predator who happened to share my mother's blood." I turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you find some way to make peace with what you've done. But you'll do it alone. Don't contact me again." The building in Seattle, I sold immediately. The $5 million went into a trust, half for Patricia to finally give her some justice for what she had lost, and half for a scholarship fund for children from low-income families. The stock shares worth $50 million I kept, but used the dividends to fund additional charitable causes. My parents' house in Montana, I donated to a nonprofit that helps struggling families. I didn't want any of it. The money felt tainted, earned through pain and deception. But I could redirect it towards something good, transform the legacy of lies into something that actually helped people. Reed handled all the legal details, and over the course of our many conversations, we became friends. He was the one who helped me understand that my parents' choices, however misguided, had come from a place of love and fear. "They were trapped," Reed explained over dinner one evening. "Diane had them in an impossible situation. They convinced themselves that living modestly was protecting you from something worse, from knowing about their crimes, from being implicated if the truth came out. In their twisted logic, poverty was safety." "But they let me suffer," I said. "They watched me struggle and did nothing. They did something. They documented everything. Your mother's journal wasn't just guilt. It was insurance, evidence that could be used to fight back if necessary. They just never found the courage to use it themselves, but they made sure you could." I thought about that a lot in the following months. My parents had been flawed, frightened people who made terrible choices, but they had also loved me in their own damaged way. The journal, the careful records, the property kept in my mother's name, these were gifts, even if they came wrapped in decades of pain. Patricia and I stayed in touch. She used her share of the money to start a nonprofit helping women escape dangerous situations. "I spent 30 years running," she told me. "Now I help other people stop running and start fighting back." 2 years later, I stood in the Seattle office of the scholarship foundation I had established with my parents' tainted fortune. The walls were covered with photos of students, bright-eyed kids who had received funding to pursue their dreams without the burden of crippling debt. Next to each photo was a brief bio describing their achievements and aspirations. "We've funded over 300 students so far," the foundation director told me during my visit. "The demand keeps growing, but thanks to the stock dividends, we can keep expanding the program." I studied the faces of those students, seeing myself in each one, the desperation to escape circumstances, the determination to build something better, the hunger for opportunity. My parents' money, earned through crime and hidden in shame, was now giving these kids what I had never had, a chance to succeed without struggling alone. Reed had come to Seattle with me for the foundation's anniversary celebration. Over dinner afterward, he raised his glass. To transformation, to taking something poisonous and making it healing. To justice, I added, even when it comes decades late. We clinked glasses, and I thought about Diane, now living in near poverty, every luxury stripped away. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that she blamed me for her downfall, that she told anyone who would listen that I had destroyed her life out of spite. She was right, in a way. I had destroyed her life, but not out of spite, out of necessity. Some people, like Diane, will never stop hurting others unless someone forces them to stop. My parents had been too broken by guilt to fight back. I was not. Thomas Blackwood had disappeared from public life entirely. His tech fortune diminished, but still substantial. He lived in quiet isolation somewhere in Oregon. I had no sympathy for his fall. He had spent 30 years profiting from his crimes while my parents suffered. Whatever discomfort he experienced now was earned. Patricia, on the other hand, thrived. Her nonprofit had helped over 1,000 women escape abusive or dangerous situations. She spoke publicly about her own experience with fraud and manipulation, using her story to help others recognize warning signs. We met quarterly for dinner, an unlikely friendship born from shared trauma and survival. "Do you ever regret it?" Patricia asked me once. "Exposing everything? You could have just taken the money and walked away." "Every day," I admitted, "but I regret what was done to us more. At least this way there's some meaning to it, some justice." "Justice is a luxury," Patricia said quietly. "For 30 years, I thought I'd never get it. You gave that to me. To both of us, really." The hardest part of the aftermath was reconciling my memories of my parents with what I now knew about them. They had not been the simple, honest people I had believed them to be. They had committed serious crimes, stolen money from an innocent person, and spent decades living a lie. But they had also been victims of Diane's manipulation, trapped by their own guilt and fear. I thought about my mother's journal often, particularly the final entries from just before she died. "I hope Marin never reads this," she had written. "I hope she goes on believing we were good people who simply didn't have much money. But if she does read it, I hope she understands we did the best we could with impossible choices. We loved her more than anything, even if we showed it in all the wrong ways." I did understand, in a way. Not enough to forgive completely, but enough to accept. My parents had been human, flawed, frightened, and ultimately broken by their own bad decisions. They had failed me in fundamental ways, but they had also tried, in their limited capacity, to protect me. Standing in the foundation office, surrounded by photos of students who would never know the dark origins of their opportunities, I felt something like peace. Not happiness. The wounds were too deep for that. But peace. The kind that comes from knowing you have taken something terrible and transformed it into something that helps others. Diane would spend the rest of her life struggling financially, a taste of the poverty she had imposed on my childhood. Thomas would live with his damaged reputation and the knowledge that his crimes had finally caught up with him, and I would continue the work of turning their poisonous legacy into healing. I walked out of the foundation office into the Seattle sunshine, Reed beside me. Somewhere in this city was the building my parents had bought with stolen money, now owned by someone else and generating revenue for honest purposes. Somewhere was the life I had built from the ruins of my childhood, stronger for having survived. "Where to next?" Reed asked. "Montana," I said. "I'm thinking about opening a branch of the foundation there. There are kids in rural areas who need help just as much as kids in cities." Reed smiled. "Your parents would be proud." "Maybe," I said. "But more importantly, those kids who grew up like I did, they deserve someone fighting for them. Someone who knows what it's like to be told there's no money for dreams when the money was there all along." As we walked toward the car, I glanced back at the foundation building one last time. My parents had stolen Patricia's money and hidden their wealth. Diane had blackmailed and manipulated for decades. Thomas had committed fraud and lived in luxury on my family's suffering. But in the end, I had the last word. I had taken their carefully constructed lies and torn them down. I had taken their hidden fortune and used it to help the people they had ignored, kids like me who deserved better than what they got. Diane was broke and alone. Thomas was disgraced and isolated. My parents' legacy was no longer a house built on lies, but a foundation that actually helped people. I had not forgiven any of them. I likely never would, but I had survived them. And in transforming their poison into healing, I had given their story the only kind of redemption any of them would ever get. Justice, I had learned, does not always heal wounds, but it closes them. It lets you move forward knowing that wrongs have been righted, that consequences have been delivered, that the people who hurt you have finally paid a price for their choices. That was enough. It had to be.